So I think one of the most interesting things to me this week was um, the chance to see the fruits of some of the things that we've been talking about. So one of the major points that I want people to understand is that writing isn't just typing. I mean, writing is really about organizing thoughts, knowing what you want to say. And if you're doing a book or thinking about doing a book, it's knowing where you're going to go in the book. I'm not talking about fiction where you may have no idea where you're going to go in your book, although you may have a plot and you know exactly where you're going in your book. There are a number of ways to do fiction, also nonfiction. But if you're writing a book, you're writing a book for a purpose. And you need to know where you're starting and where you're going. What is it that you want to say in the book? Usually a book is about, unless it's a memoir, a book is about something. You want to get something across to people. So it helps to know what it is you want to get across and where you're starting and where you want to end. What is it that you have to tell people along the way for them to know what you want them to know or feel what you want them to feel? And so these are things you actually have to work out. And you have to sit down with pen and paper or, on a computer. And my way of thinking about it is to chunk it into chapters and just write one sentence about how each chapter moves along, gets you closer to the goal. So it's like you're traveling, and this first chapter goes this distance, and the second chapter takes you here, and the third chapter takes you here, and pretty soon you get to the end knowing what you want people to know. And so it just helps if you sit down and write one sentence, and that's all, one sentence, because having that clarity is just so extraordinarily helpful. Because in the process of writing, you just get bogged down and you lose sight of what your goal is. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. And I hope it happens to every writer. I hope they get so deeply into what they do. So sitting down and just having that grand big picture of, so the first chapter does this and the second chapter does that. And here's how we get from A to Z. And I really believe very strongly in that. And I really believe it's so worth the while to take the time to just, write it down and get it into one sentence. And then this week, I was very privileged to have that come back to me. Someone with whom I've been speaking, and who I can't remember if he has been on any of these specific Sundays, but with whom I've spoken privately over time and given as homework assignments the kinds of things that we've talked about here. And so I got back, hey, would you take a look at this rough outline of the book? And, I was just so pleased to see it because it was so clear on what its mission was and how it was going to accomplish its mission and how each chapter contributed to that mission. And it's just a delight to see that. And that clarity is really needed. And the writer, was grateful for having been given the assignment to focus and to develop that clarity of mind. And all I can tell you is that if you ever intend to write a book, you are going to need to remember what your goal is for each chapter, that very simplified one sentence goal, because everything in that chapter has to advance that goal, just as each one of those sentences explains how it's going to advance the goal to the end. So, so I'm a happy camper right now, having seen that, taken a look at that yesterday and seen how someone is actually using it to move forward with a project, to get a book project going. And yes, Virginia, it can happen. And these things do matter, and they do help, and they do help you think. And that's what a book is for. It should be about ideas and gets you where you want to go. Now, whether there'll be a market for that book, I can't say. I happen to think there will be for this particular book. I think it's really interesting, and clarifying it out, you know, sentence by sentence in the outline, in the chapter structure, clarifying it that way also reminds you of the importance of what you're going to say, because you could see it very clearly. I am doing this book because, wow, we're starting here and we're telling people something that they didn't really know and giving them an inside picture of something. And so when you clarify it like that, you have the ability to see the real importance of what it is that you're doing. And trust me, in the course of doing a book, that could be very motivating, because in the course of doing a book, the slogging often gets very tough. And having a reminder of the value of doing the book and its importance can be a great motivator along the way. So it's always nice to get feedback in the form of something that someone's actually done that shows how they are using these principles to go forward. I would be happy to show you the rough outline, but I don't have permission of the person. And I think the idea is better. It's an important one. I think perhaps it needs some privacy until it is further along. So I'm sorry for talking about a hypothetical, but what's not hypothetical is a single sentence approach to each chapter, whittling the thought down into a single sentence as to how each chapter is moving along. And some will actually move sideways, but how the whole entire enterprise moves along through the structure. And that really is the important point that I wanted to emphasize. And I would love to deal with any questions that anybody has about writing or editing or doing stuff in this whole realm. It would be my privilege to take any questions that people have.
Can you talk a little bit about goals at the end of each chapter? Like, how do you map those out in the right way ahead of time? And how do you make sure that you're sticking to those goals?
So when you say the goals of like what each chapter is going to be in a book?
Yes.
So your goals are, when you write that one sentence about what each chapter is, that tells you what your goals are. My first chapter for A Nation of Wimps was to introduce the idea that children today are wildly overprotected. So I had that was one sentence. Kids today are wildly overprotected. So my goal was to demonstrate to people that that was happening. The rest of my book was devoted to telling people why that wasn't such a good idea. But in my first chapter, I had to establish that this is in fact going on and establish that it was happening, and that everybody was, or a lot of everybody was doing it. And even in things they might not recognize were examples of this. So my chapter was filled with anecdotes, examples, data, things people said that showed how they or their children, things that they would do and considered necessary for them to do for their children, and things that children were saying. So all of that was the goal of my first chapter. How did I stick to that goal? I stuck to that goal because I had that outline in not only in my head, but on paper. I can't tell you how many times when you're writing a book that you are going back and looking at your one sentence or one paragraph. Eventually you'll beef it up. When you write a proposal, you're going to beef up that one sentence into a longer paragraph. But that essential one sentence, you're always going to come back. You always have to be reminded. I don't care what project you're on. I don't care whether it's a moonshot. You always have to be reminded of what your goal is, because you are always, your days are going to be consumed with many little things that are sideways to the goal, but that have to be dealt with on your way getting to the goal. So you always need a reminder. And especially in writing a book, and especially first chapter, I have to say, the impulse is to tell the whole story in the first chapter. But of course you can't. Otherwise you'd have a first chapter of 500 pages. So you constantly have to refer back, and which is why putting in that painstaking clarity of thinking in the beginning becomes so important, because it's your guide all the way through. And every time you go to write something or a chunk of something, or to move into some new idea, you have to understand how it relates to that goal that you expressed as the point of your first chapter. And it helps to very explicitly state all of this information that you're about to read for the next 3 pages relates to this goal by X. You can explicitly state how it relates to the main point. I do this in articles, and I edit this into articles, and it's even more important in a book to constantly remind the reader of how the following information, or the information they've just read, relates to the goal. So as you can see, I mean, this is what you're saying, as you can see, Johnny was overprotected. And parents don't realize that they're doing this because they justify it these many ways. Or let's go to a soccer game and see what happens, and how so much of what's going on is parents on the sidelines reinforcing each other in being over-involved and over-managing their children. So the goal isn't left to chance, and sticking to the goal is very explicitly stated as you go. Now, how artfully you do that is going to vary with each writer and depending on the skill of the writer. And sometimes it'll be pretty flat-footed, and other times it'll just be very apparent. It might be apparent in a quote, but that's where the skill of the writer comes in. So a book involves a lot of work, and it's particularly important to have that goal statement in your chapter summary and your outline, because you refer back to it, and it literally keeps you in line, and it helps you stick to your goal. And every time you go to explore a new facet of what you're writing about, you have to know in your head and tell the reader how it advances the goal that you've explicitly stated of that chapter. So that's how you stick to it. And it doesn't matter the size of the project or the type of the project. As I said, your goal could be to get someone to the moon or to Mars in a spacecraft. You're going to be doing a lot of things along the way that don't look directly related, and you always have to know how it is related, and that's how you stay motivated as well as stay on track. Does that have any value to you as an answer, Debbie?
Absolutely. Can you just also tell me, when you're mapping out a book, is it a good idea to map out all of your chapters ahead of time with your goal for each chapter set already, so that there's a theme running through? Is that something that you would suggest?
So you have to do, I mean, if you want to get a book contract, you absolutely have to. I mean, here's how I envision a book proposal. So a book proposal will have a short statement about the book and why it's necessary to have the book, why it's important to write this book, and why this needs to be said. And then you have your 8 or 10 chapters, and for your first pass through it, when you're beginning to work up the idea for a book, my approach is to map out where you are and where you want to go, and delineate your 8 or 10 chapters in one sentence each. When you actually do a book proposal that you send to a publisher, that one sentence will be expanded into a paragraph. I don't know very many publishers who would invest a lot of money in a book proposal and that wasn't more than a sentence per chapter. I mean, I suppose if you've written 40 books and you've worked with the publisher and the editor a long time, they would trust you enough so that you could do that. But I don't know anybody whose book proposal doesn't have a good chunky paragraph for explaining what each chapter is, what its goal is, and a rough, maybe bullet point statement of what will be in this chapter. So that's, and then you have 10 pages like that because it's your 10 chapters. There's more to a proposal than that, but that's the nub of your book proposal. And that is to guarantee to a publisher that they are actually investing their money into something they know is worthy of being a book, but it's also vitally important to the writer to know what it is that's going to in each chapter and what it's going to contain. Because when you're writing, one idea flows into another, and you almost have to deconstruct your topic. There are any millions of ways you could slice and dice a topic. Your book is going to do it the way that you feel most comfortable with, and you stick to that as a discipline, because ideas about any subject of experience are going to kind of run together. So, it's in this chapter that I talk about, give examples of how parents overmanage their children. It's in this chapter that I give a historical perspective on when in the past that was done and what the special circumstances were and how we regarded it and what the outcome was. It's in this chapter that I begin to set up why this is bad for kids. It's in this chapter that I set up tell more about why it's bad for kids and how it shows up in all these many ways, which you might not have realized were reflections of this aberrant parental behavior. It's in this chapter when I explain why it's bad for parents. It's in this chapter where I explain why it's bad for the culture. It's in this chapter where I explain why it's bad for democracy. And so you see how this builds towards making my case that overmanaging children, taking all the lumps and bumps out of the life for them, is just not healthy for kids and for the whole society. So that's the whole point of my book, but I can't tell it all in one chapter. So that keeps me disciplined to have that outline of what goes into each chapter. And you really, really, really do refer to it, because you can get really lost in the weeds as you go. No, this part of it goes into this chapter, and another part of it goes into another chapter, which is not to say that while you're writing, you're not going to have to, you might decide to move something around. You might decide that more of what you're talking about belongs in one chapter than another and move it around. And that's fine. That happens to every writer when they're doing a book, I think. And you do get into dilemmas where you do have, as you get deeper into your topic and into your writing, you're going to make some decisions where, well, gee, I had it this way in my outline, but I think actually this whole topic, if I give it a slightly different slant, really belongs better in this chapter, because this slant is more accurate and opens up to more information. So that broadened chapter outline that becomes your proposal keeps you in line and reminds you of what your task is for that chapter. Does that explain? Have I?
Yeah. So basically, it's really just like an outline for any kind of writing, that you're just making a big outline for your book. And
you're making a big outline, but you're also, it is, and that outline is really very important, but you're also filling in a little bit here and there, because your outline has the job of selling an editor and a publisher on the worthiness of the story that you're going to have to tell. So yes, so it's an outline that's fleshed out in part. Some of it will be fleshed out, and other of it will be just, in bullet point in your proposal. So, I can't off the top of my head. I wish I had it with me somewhere on my hard drive. My proposal for my book, A Nation of Wimps. Each chapter in my book proposal itself, which goes to the agent who sends it off to interested editor, who will have to persuade their publisher to invest the money in it. Let's assume that each chapter has a page to itself. And on that page, I envision a paragraph, a paragraph of about 15 lines, 20 lines, and then some bullet explaining with a certain amount of charm what'll be in the chapter and why that chapter and how that chapter is advancing the book. And then it'll have a bunch of bullet points under it about this chapter will tell, stories of, children who were, whose parents didn't let them do this. And so part of it will be fleshed out, and part of it will really be literally bullet point, outlining form. You won't do it, A and then under it 1. You're going to be doing it more in a narrative way, and you'll have bullet points. But yes, that's really an outline form, and you need that. You will be using it just as an outline becomes very important in writing a thesis or anything else. And I don't really care what you're writing, even if it's something short. An outline may be totally in your head. There's always an outline. An outline may be totally in your head. But when you're doing something as long as a book, you actually need it on paper to remind you. Because there's so much there. It's more than you can keep in working memory. So you need your fleshed out outline that is a book proposal. But yeah, having learned to outline, which is of course something that you learn in the course of getting a PhD. Am I not correct, Debbie? Something you must do.
Outlining, jumping through hoops, the whole 9 yards. Yes, it's one component of it for sure.
Right. And I hope that kids are still taught in school how to outline their essays, because outlining is really very important. You learn how to structure your ideas, and that's the only way you can manage telling a big story that isn't just a narrative tale of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then that happened, where you're following a time sequence and just recounting what happened. Which is how, if you follow the development of storytelling at all, I mean, that is how we evolved over the millennia in telling stories. And now we have nonfiction that deals with ideas, and so you do have to manage them, and outlines are absolutely critical.
That's very helpful. I think that that eases some anxiety too, knowing that you can just build your structure and then work within it. It takes a lot of the anxiety away from thinking that, wow, I have to start something, get the prose going and just keep going. Whereas really, just like if you're doing a dissertation or if you're doing any other kind of research work, you want to know what you're looking for all along. You want to map it out and have areas that you're able to fill in. So
yes, exactly. And it takes as much as it takes away the anxiety of the writer, and it'll take away the anxiety of the writer every single day, it also takes away the anxiety of the editor, who knows that he or she is making an investment in something and there's stuff there, and takes away the anxiety of the publisher because they know that there is enough to fill a book and they are investing in something. But yeah, and you know, I'm sure that every writer has had the experience, because I've certainly had it, and I don't think I am unique. I am not so narcissistic as to think everything I do is unique and fabulous. But there are things I have on my outline that I love itemizing things on an outline. And knowing the kinds of things that I'm going to discuss. And it's really good to have that in an outline. It may turn out that things that you've itemized in an outline get subsumed and get spoken about in other discussions, so that you wind up crossing them out of your outline as a whole separate topic, but they are discussed, and you have the security of knowing that that point that you thought important enough is discussed somewhere, although it may come out of your outline as something to be talked about in a very specific order. So yeah, an outline is absolutely critical to working on anything that's going to extend, I don't know, to me, more, even articles that I'm doing in a day. An outline is critical for me to know how I'm going to say what needs to be said. And first I have to think what needs to be said to tell the story. And then in a word, I just might itemize, scratch it down on a piece of paper, 10 things that need to be said. It's not a formal outline, but I refer to it while I'm writing an article. These are the things that I need to be talking about. And even if that's within a day, or I'm writing a blog post, I'm doing that. Imagine writing a book, something that you work on for months, and maybe many, many months, maybe more than a year, very often more than a year. You just can't keep it all in working memory. So you have to have an outline.
Can you tell me just give me say I decided, hey, I'd like to go write a book, and I have an idea. Let's just say the idea is that mentoring is a necessary part of life. I'm just making something up. So let's say I decided that. How would you, if you were going to write that book or any other book, what would you do first? And can you go through the steps of how you would approach the whole process?
Sure. Okay, this is great, Debbie. This is great. So we're essentially going to be brainstorming here, and the ideas that we come up with won't necessarily be in the right order. Right now, so what needs to be said if you're going to write a book about mentoring is necessary? Okay, so what needs to be said is that lots of important people have been mentored. There are many, many forms of mentoring. Some you might not even know as mentoring, but they serve. Okay, here's another thing. What is the function of mentoring? What is good mentoring? How does one get a mentor? why is mentoring necessary? What does it really do? Um, um, what kinds of things, what happens in the course of mentoring that makes it so necessary? Um, how have other people gotten mentors? And is there any stage at life, where you get where it's better to have a mentor or not? Or is mentoring something that happens all the way through? Um, Having a mentor, being a mentor. Um, is being a mentor as necessary as having a mentor? And why is being a mentor so fabulous? Um, Ways of being a mentor. I mean, these are just coming off the top of my head. So, you're just kind of throwing these down, and this is without knowing the details of mentoring that all of the information that you know about mentoring. And I'm not censoring any of these ideas. And, each one, is like a yellow sticky note. And maybe some of them are good and some of them aren't. But this is not the time to decide that. First, you want to get out everything. And then you kind of want to begin to order them. Is there some sequence that makes sense to you? Not everybody would do a book the same way, but you want to do it in a way that makes sense to you and that calls on your best ability to tell a story, because everybody has a different way of doing things and different sensibility, and you want to do it in the way that's most felicitous for you, that gives you the greatest scope for saying things the way you like to say them. So that's what I would do. And keep, so remember, the thesis of your book is mentoring is necessary. And so when you consider what each chapter is going to be about, you want to remember how it advances the idea that mentoring is necessary.
So you would brainstorm, you would come up with all of the ideas, and
right.
Then do you pick which ones you would want as a chapter? Is that what you would do next?
Yeah, and I mean, and brainstorming might include doing some research on mentoring, and am I covering all aspects of it? What is it that people want to know, that I know? Sometimes you don't even realize how much you know and assume that other people want to know about the topic. So, and what goes on internally? You're a psychologist. What goes on internally? What's the inside picture of mentoring that makes it so valuable? I mean, that's where you can add something that no one else could. That's where you have something very special to say. That's an area of expertise that you have. There are a lot of people, or there are some people who write about mentoring, and they talk about how important it is, but you can talk about how the psychological value of it to the mentee and the mentor. And that's something that only you, as a psychologist, could bring to the topic. But you may, want to spend some time looking around, doing a little research on certainly before you formalized a list of topics that would arrange themselves somehow into chapters or parts of chapters. And see, do they sort themselves in any specific way? Do they sort themselves into clusters? Do they cluster? Does all the ideas that I threw out, do they cluster in some significant way? Is there another approach to this topic that I've left out that is something people want to know about mentoring? What are the questions? What are the most important questions that I get asked as an expert in mentoring? Again, you're in a unique position to tell people. And also the very many, and one of the other things, I mean, you have this phenomenal experience, and something you know is the enormous number of ways that people can be mentored. And there's this, not every way is for every person, either mentor or mentee. But you want people to think about the very many ways that they could be mentored in something, and why it's good, and how mentoring can be project specific, can be overall, career boosting. I mean, the very many ways that it can be done and why it's so good. So these are, and this is, I wouldn't restrict myself. This is just coming from someone who isn't inside the information. I would imagine that here's something. You're inside the information. When you're thinking about a book and the big picture, in a way, you want to step outside the information. You want to use all the inside information you have to know, to say what you know, but you also want to step outside to ask the question, what do people want to know? What do people need to know? It's really, really important to do that, to step outside your own expertise and to say, what does the people ask and want to know, and why do they want to know it? Because all those things will have to be addressed in one way or another in the book that you are thinking about doing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, this was all very helpful. And I think that what you said applies to every topic that a person could write about. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, let's stick with this idea for a bit. So aside from the things that I mentioned, if you were writing a book on mentoring is necessary, what would you want to see in that?
If I were writing a book on mentoring, I would come at it from the perspective of the mentor. And I would want to talk about how mentoring benefits the mentor, physically,
Right.
emotionally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And show the different ways individuals, it shows up in individuals and how they give back and what they get out of it, and with their particular examples in the way in which they do it.
Right.
That's something that that's the way that I would approach it. And
just think, look at that just for a second. Stop right there and look at that, because so with every single mentoring experience, you're coming at it from the mentor's perspective. And so you would be talking to mentors. But if you really wanted to increase the value of what you would do for some of those mentors that you talk to, you would also want to talk to the one or more of their mentees to find out from their perspective what they got out of it. and how they got something out of it. So, right there, it gives you a richness of stories to tell.
Absolutely. I think that that's so smart to say that you should have both sides of the coin there. So often, it's looked at in one dimension, and you're right, it should be brought about to look at it from both the mentor and the mentee perspective, regardless of which way you're presenting the book, whether you're doing it from the mentee perspective or the mentor. Love that.
Yeah. And that because we know what they're going to get out of it may not even be aligned. I mean, the mentor may be getting something out of it that's different from what the mentee gets out of it. The mentor may be getting all these emotional rewards, all these psychological benefits, and the mentee may be getting very domain specific knowledge about something. So it's always very interesting to see something from an experience that involves more than one person. It's very interesting to see it from both perspectives. And that way it's illuminating for both sides of that single mentoring experience.
I agree. And I think it's important to also look at the differences in, most people think that from what you're saying, this triggered this thought. Most people think of mentors as being, it's hierarchical. One is the expert and the other is a newbie in everything. But you could be mentoring, which I know you do. You often mentor high-level experts in certain areas that, do tremendous things, but you're the mentor for them. You're explaining to them how to write. I'd love to get their perspective on being mentored by someone, since they're likely the mentor to others in a whole lot of different disciplines. It's just very interesting. You bring out a lot of points that make it all, by having that outline, by having that way of thinking of it, it forces you to dig deeper, and I like that.
Right, and just think of all the richness that's there. And here's something. So in your proposal, you would want to, this would be so persuasive to an editor and a publisher if you, in a proposal, sort of capsulized or did in depth one mentor mentee experience, just to show all of the richness that's in it, and and how it works, and how two people may not be getting the same things out of it, and how experts here can be mentored by other experts there, and you get this enormous cross-fertilization. And it can happen at any age and any kind of experience. Yeah, I mean, I love mentoring an astronaut, and how to do a book. I love mentoring, world-class experts in something, at the same time that I'm getting stuff from them. So it's, you have this very rich experience, and you're likely dealing with people who can articulate things well. And I would try and bring a snapshot of that into a proposal. I think it would be very persuasive to a publisher for a lot of reasons, because one, it would demonstrate how human the book is going to be. They're going to be real people and real voices, whether or not the people go on record with their names or not, whether it's still going to have this rich human feel. And then it's just going to have all this lush inside and experience. It's not just going to be this dry academic description. It's going to be inside the experience. and inside the head of a mentor and a mentee. And all of that adds value to a proposal, which will also have your outline, but it would be advantageous to have a snapshot of one of these experiences and what they're getting out of it. A 1 or 2 page, deep dive into something like that. It would be exceedingly persuasive in a proposal.
So would your recommendation be to a person who's going to write a book, whether it's an astronaut writing about something or it's a psychologist writing about something, that they make their outline, that they that they brainstorm, then they make an outline, and then based on that, they take the choicest pieces and weave it into a proposal? Is that the order that you would put it in?
I would say they do their outline and then they write their, chapter summary and what's going to go into the chapter. But when you do, each book proposal is going to have a sample chapter or a sample section of a chapter. Lead with your strengths. I mean, this is how we navigate through the world. Take a very choice bit of it and give someone a picture of that and lead with that strength. And you may have to do research to do it and put that in your proposal, whether it's part of a chapter summary or it's your sample of what your book is going to feel like and smell like and taste like. Yes, that should be in a proposal because you're selling. A proposal is selling your idea. And why not sell your strength and the strength of what it is that you're going to be doing and the value it's going to have for other people? You definitely want to lead with a sample of the richness that's going to be eventually within those covers. And I can't emphasize that enough. Lead with your strengths. It's like when you do a resume. I'm sure everybody, and I hope everybody in the world has been fired once, but you don't lead your resume with what you've been, all the times you've been fired. You lead your resume with your strengths and what you're doing and, how well you do it. And maybe being fired can be inferred from maybe the juxtaposition of, 2 jobs and the timeline or something, but it's not something that's ever in your resume usually. And the same thing with a, proposal. You're showing off the strength of your idea and your ability to execute this idea. That's what your proposal is. Why is an editor choosing you to tell the world about this idea, and why is a publisher choosing to invest in you to tell this story? You want to just go with something really good, and this book will be filled with more examples of mentors and mentees, and it will look at many more examples across many industries and show the many ways that mentors and mentees cross-fertilize each other.
You have Charlie on live stream, and he was able to pick up that you were talking about him. And Charlie is an astronaut who's mentored countless people. And
he is just like, he's got such a great idea going.
And yeah, Charlie's great. Everybody loves Charlie. And he says that he thought that a great tip that you shared was to brainstorm and list multiple titles and subtitles. And he also said that you are the first mentor he's had in a very long time, and he totally knows why this is important and necessary. And, I heard from you prior to this how you so enjoy working with Charlie. It's just amazing to see how you're both getting so much out of it. And hearing from you, it's not even like work, it's a pleasure. And for him too, it's just really lovely to see this, because writing is something that is so, there's a vulnerability for someone who's going to write. There's just a level of, you have to really give a bunch of yourself to someone and trust that they're not going to trample you, right? And
Right.
so you have a unique sort of mentorship here, where you're sort of taking somebody's, baby, essentially, their thoughts, what's so important to them. And so I just wanted to pass along what Charlie's been saying in the chat on the live stream, because it's nice to hear you speaking and him, and to see
Great.
writing.
Yeah. So yeah, and so he brings up another point where the brainstorming of, so my point in talking about the chapters was you want to absolutely clarify what it is that each chapter is going to be and how it advances your idea of the book. But by brainstorming a title, of course, you have to be far enough along to or immersed enough in your topic to brainstorm a title, and he certainly was, because this is his life's work. It isn't always this case with a journalist who is setting out to write a book on a certain topic before they've done a totally deep dive into it. They might have done a shallower dive, or they might have been asked by someone to help them write a book. But to brainstorm a title is just exceedingly clarifying. And, I had to do it myself this week. I had to come up with a title for an article. And I had to come up with a couple of titles for articles, actually. And I do want to say that it is so mentally clarifying to come up with a title, to do the work of thinking of a title. And there are always more than one way to approach a title. I mean, there are just many ways that a title can come at what you want to say, the information or the attitude toward it. And that's why it's really great to brainstorm ideas without you don't have to necessarily settle on a title, but just brainstorming ideas, it just focuses your attention on what is the core of what you're doing and why it's important. And that's just enormously helpful in engaging in this deep enterprise of writing a book, which is going to colonize your brain for longer than you might want it to. But yay, I'm glad that people have gotten something out of it. I always love what I get out of it when I brainstorm titles. Sometimes I know exactly what the title is going to be. But if I don't, I'm usually with my pen, my very specific Uniball fine point pen and pad. I'm never without pen and paper, even when I have my digital devices with me. And I'm thinking about ideas. Sometimes a headline will come to you. One of my favorite headlines ever was, I don't know if anyone remembers the magazine Lear's, but it was a general interest cultural magazine started by Frances Lear, who was the divorced wife of Norman Lear, the great Hollywood producer, developer of so many shows from All in the Family on, and still going strong at 90 something. And you know, he's a big deal. And she started, when they divorced, she moved to New York and started Lear's magazine. And I won't give you the backstory. She called me to ask me to be the editor of Lear's. And I met with her, not knowing, just because I'm a little dense on some things, not knowing that she, until I got to her apartment, not knowing that she was the newly divorced wife of Norman Lear. I can tell this story because it's been told in New York Magazine, but she invited me to her apartment. She called me and said, I hear you're the best editor in New York. I'm starting a magazine for the woman who wasn't born yesterday. Will you come and talk to me? And so I was invited to her apartment, which was in the Ritz on the corner of 57th and Park Avenue. And rang the buzzer, entered the door. I was announced, ushered into the elevator, got off at her door, rang the bell, and no one answered the door. And finally, the butler came and let me in while he was squabbling with someone. And I just stood in the foyer of the apartment, and I said, well, is there anyone here to take my coat? It was in December of, I think, 1986 or 87, something like that. And no one was, so I just let myself into the living room, sat down, realized that there was a drop screen, a full-size theater screen that dropped from the ceiling, and then I sort of put two and two together and realized that she must be related to Norman Lear. And she came up from downstairs. It was a multi-level apartment. She came up from downstairs and proceeded to tell me that she was starting a magazine for the woman who wasn't born yesterday, and repeated a litany of things to me, like, this woman, her husband's fucking the secretary, and these are her exact words. This woman is depressed. She's got some gray hair, and her husband's fucking the secretary. Whoa. And I'm taking notes. I mean, if you're going to be the editor-in-chief for someone, you want to know what publication you're getting into. And so she finished this litany, and I said to her, you know, I'm 40 years old, but this isn't the story of my life or many people that I know. And in total classic line, she said to me, well, your problem is you're not depressed and you've never been depressed. I've been chewing that over for a couple of decades. Your problem is you're not depressed. In any case, you can understand that we were not compatible for my having anything to do with her book, her magazine. But a couple of years later, I noticed that this magazine, which really had a lot of buzz in New York, could use a little help editorially. And so I dropped her a note and asked her if she wanted to talk to me, that I thought I could help her improve some of the stuff in her magazine. And she had someone call me and say, come in. And I went in and she said to me, well, where would you start? And I said, well, I'd start with the cover and I'd improve your cover lines. So I was given the charge for a year of writing the cover lines for Lear's magazine. And the cover line that got me the job was she had her staff send me every single article that was going into the next issue. So she did this for a year. That's how long I was a consultant to her. And the first issue that she sent, one of the lead articles was on how network television was diminishing. And as we all know, it has. I mean, we've got cable, we've got, umpteen million channels, more than we know what to do with. And basically her piece was a big FU to her husband. But for the cover line, I suggested to her, it was how the networks were losing viewers. The cover line I suggested was the big turnoff. And she did actually run that headline. It was fun. And I did that for a year for her. And it's very clarifying to summarize a story in 3 words. You really have to get into the story, then you have to get it out of the story and outside it. And you can look at it from many different angles. And it could be fun to do that. And people enjoy looking at something that's going to be called, it's going to attract someone's attention. The big turnoff. You don't immediately know that it's about television networks losing viewers, but you soon learn that. At least it attracts people into the topic. So it's always very clarifying to brainstorm on titles, whether it's for articles, whether it's for books. And it's a fun process. And if you approach it as a fun process, you learn more about your topic. And all of that helps you do your work.